Which came first, the chicken or the egg? Or, sorry, maybe I got that wrong. Which came first, the chicken or the spaceship? Because when we saw this tiny UFO on the Starr Park website, the obvious connection was it being a reference to the 8-bit minigame, which contained an alien chicken. But fast forward several months to season 11, and that spaceship turned out to be Eve's. So the question is, was that always the case? Because originally, the investor video was the one drawing references from the game. Dynamite, Gale, Shelly, and tons of Easter eggs pointed towards many well-known brawlers. But we're now 3 years since the release of the investor video, and we're still getting steady references to it. And while the dev team definitely has concepts lined up for future use, I highly doubt that the content they were able to foreshadow has lasted this long. In Time to Explain, the Brawl Stars podcast covering the inner workings of the dev team, we were told the lore, quote, never went away, and I think the confusion of this mostly stems from the separation of Brawler lore and Starr Park lore. To clarify, rather than having ARG elements like the WKBRL stream, Starr Park packages, the minigame, or other interactive features, we've seen the team move to exclusively in-game content, and more of an implied mystery. And because of this, it seems like Supercell is now taking elements from the investor video and using them as part of a recipe to make new brawlers, which keeps the lore relevant. And I say this because they even said that they were discussing making the narrator from the investor video a brawler, but ultimately ended up scrapping it. And so let's take a moment to discuss the design of each brawler, how they're connected to or based off of Starr Park, what that means, and how it affects the murky story of Brawl Stars. I'm a Turnip. Today we're going to get to the bottom of this and below, and welcome to Sub-Zero. Since we started off with Eve, let's analyze her a little bit more closely, because as said before, it's quite strange that we started off with an alien chicken and ended up with a flea from outer space. Because a long time ago, just as the Season 5 Brawl Pass was releasing, one of the theories revolving around the Star Force trio was that it was going to involve brawlers that were already known by the community. This was mainly because Colonel Ruff's was originally a concept art for when the game was being themed around space, and when they moved to the Wild West theme, it got thrown into the bin along with everything else. But thankfully for this good boy, he made a comeback in the 8-bit minigame as one of the enemies that would shoot missiles at your spaceship. And since the chicken was on the same team and Kit was the brawler that was teased before Ruff's, it was assumed that these 3 brawlers would make up the trio. But then Squeak was released, which mostly disproved this idea. However, hope was not lost for Kit, as we saw more foreshadowing of them with a pin of a certain familiar face on Squeak's backpack strap. But sadly, any hope of Kit being a brawler vanished as Eve made her way into the spotlight. Except that wasn't entirely true, as they already were and always had been in the game, because from the very beginning, Kit had and always has been Shelly's cat. Look at the pin again. Kit is wearing a yellow bandana around their neck, the same exact one as Shelly in her base model. And if we look at the community post announcing Brawl Talk, we can see Shelly looking up in shock as Kit's belongings lay scattered around her home. Their food bowl, their photo, and with Shelly's clothes all point to this cat being Kit. And surprise, surprise, the chicken was also in the game at one point too, because back in Alpha, Shelly had a second pet, a chicken that would follow her into battle, but this was given the boot because it gave away her location whenever she entered a bush, making her much easier to spot for enemies. And all of that fits logically as both of them are Shelly's pets, but why is it a normal chicken here and a presumably anthropomorphic chicken here? Ruff certainly is, and I mean, I'm no expert, but I don't think normal chickens can fly spaceships. And the same question can be applied to other creatures within this world such as Crow. Mr. P is a mascot, as we can see by the zipper, but from what we can tell, Crow is a living, breathing humanoid crow, and his description supports this by calling him a, quote, enigmatic creature. And what's even stranger is his connection to the Star Force trio. If we take a look at Crow's back, we can see the insignia of a cat. Nothing too groundbreaking until you notice the big X on its left eye. And you know who else has a big X in their left eye? Colonel Ruff's. A pattern is starting to emerge here, and this rabbit hole goes even deeper. Side tangent here, it's worth noting that Alley Cat Bull also has this logo, and I'm not exactly sure what to make of it. In fact, it's a little tedious, because this same exact skin and this same exact cat causes another problem later in this video. It could be that Crow is a part of the Alley Cat gang, and that would make sense as Bull and Crow are canonically in the same gang with their default models, but I don't even want to go into whether skins are different brawlers, because that's a whole can of worms, since in the esports mystery, Archvillain B is revealed to be one of the masterminds behind the stolen trophy operation, but like 2 episodes later, Normal B is just standing there in the police lineup, and at this point we know she's part of the League of Villains. Yeah, she didn't steal the trophy, but she's still orchestrating it. Why is she just standing there? Aren't you gonna press charges? Why is she not in handcuffs? Where's the trial? I demand justice! But really, the main takeaway from this is that all these anthropomorphic animals are connected. Now, many of us were shocked when we got a new Morse code in the biodome environment, that being alien DNA. Morse code goes hand in hand with lore, and this was no exception, though this meaning was seemingly much more straightforward. This season is entirely about mutation, as we're told in the Brawl Talk.
This lab is where we create all the beautiful flowers, plants, and creatures in Starr Park.
and the animations start off with Eve crashing through the ceiling and corrupting the entirely uncovered batch of mystery liquid in the middle of the gardens. Yeah, because I'm sure that's not an OSHA violation. This has been deduced to be the alien DNA mentioned on the clipboard by multiple others in the community, which results in the mutation of anyone who touches it. After all, we can see some sort of purple substance leak into the ground after she crashes, which B takes out and examines before Eve makes her getaway. But what's really fascinating is the association with the color purple. Can you think of anything else with a strong connection to that color? That's right, the very same gems that Brawlers fight over in Gem Grab. And I'm not just drawing the connection purely on the color, because in the Super City animation, we can see Jackie, Bee, and Tick working in the gem mines, when suddenly the same purple glow explodes from the ground and corrupts them all into monsters, which is the exact same thing that happens in the biodome. So, you're saying that gems contain alien DNA? Well, yes, I am, but I can go deeper. As per usual, we can always rely on Ranter to give us a deeper insight into how things work, and one of the biggest parts of the rant involves him saying,
"And I put that R over my favorite word, gem. And I squeeze it right in the middle. What does it turn into? Germ! Germ! Germ!"
Gems are germs. It's one of the most clear-cut things he says. What kind of germs? A virus. An alien virus. You see, viruses are kind of a fickle thing in the scientific community, as they're so simple that they blend the border of what is alive and what is not. They're literally just strands of DNA that kind of shove themselves into the cells of other creatures, a disease that literally cannot reproduce without other life forms, and as such we come full circle, linking everything back to Eve, because throughout history many terrible plagues have wreaked havoc on humanity, for example the Black Plague, and for a very long time it was thought that the rats were the main carriers of this disease, but they were wrong, because it was actually spread by the fleas hitching rides on the rat's fur. And I believe that's why Eve was chosen over the two characters. That's her connection to the lore. She's a carrier of this disease, the same one that she spreads to the biodome. And that alien DNA is what gives animals intelligence by mutating their genes. And this is also supported by the fact that Squeak's backstory involves him evolving from the saliva on Colonel Ruff's squeaky toys. His DNA has already been altered, which is what allowed Squeak to be born. All the animal brawlers that aren't mascots, that being Gro, Ruff, Squeak, Eve, Otis, and Hank, are all creatures affected by this germ. Though, if all this is true, the implications are even stranger. We can see in the investor video that Starr Park is mining these gems from somewhere in the park, bringing them out by the cartload while bagging them up, so it seems like they aren't synthesizing the gems themselves and instead harvesting them from the environment. We know that Starr Park is abusing the virus. This is pretty much canon simply by the fact that Bee extracted it and the biodome is used to create the creatures in Starr Park. But how did the gems get there? Because somehow we went from alien germs being somewhere in space to having Starr Park force others to rip the gems out of the ground. And the gems obviously existed before the biodome season, which means there's really only a couple of options. First up, pretty much every single name in the game means something, whether it's a pun or an allusion to an inspiration of their design, and I believe Eve's name is also worth looking at here, because Eve means to come before, meaning that either something like her came to Earth before, or that some sort of object carried the virus here long ago. This concept revolves around panspermia. Now, if you don't know what that is, it's basically the theory that DNA, or the ingredients for DNA, fly around space until they crash into a planet suitable for life. Think of the Blob from the 1958 movie, which was definitely an inspiration for another member of the Star Force trio. In a similar manner, what if a long time ago there was some sort of asteroid or meteor that carried these gems and crashed into Earth, and Starr Park discovered it, built on top of it, and began to mine out the substance within? But yet again, to get to that conclusion, we have to assume a lot of things, so let's look at the second option, which is that Starr Park farms the virus in the gem mines themselves. Let's say that the growing conditions under the park are perfect for actually farming the virus. They plant or bury it underground and allow it to feed off the radiation in the park, since one of the canon pieces of inspiration is that, quote, a nuclear explosion irradiates all the theme park workers in the story, which corrupts all their thinking. And that connects to what Ranter says about radioactive spaghetti in the park.
We're like a penne that is so lethal, no one knows what to do with it. You can't store it anywhere. Being so incredibly powerful, they have to bury it 10,000 feet underground with a half-life of 1 billion years.
And after a certain period of time, the gems are then ready to be harvested and collected by the players, which then allows them to continue performing all their diabolical experiments. So to recap, Eve is likely based off of an alien flea that carries the same type of germs talked about by Ranter, hence the Morse code saying alien DNA, which is what Starr Park uses to mutate the creatures within the game. And speaking of mutated creatures, let's talk about our newest brawler, Cordelius. Once just another employee at Starr Park, Cordelius is a pun on the name Cornelius mixed with the word for the genus Cordyceps, which if you don't know is a type of mushroom, but not just any mushroom, because this one is something straight out of a horror film, or game if you haven't watched The Last of Us. But these fungi typically target insects, infecting their hosts with spores before getting inside their minds and forcing them to do their will. And if you look at Cordelius, this is exactly the same thing that has happened with him. As Danny and Paula said in Brawl Talk, he was once just a simple gardener before the toxicity of the place drove him mad. And this has several connections to the lore. The first is the actual mushroom itself. Much like how the spores of Cordyceps brainwash their victims, these ones appear to have done the same to him, causing him to go on a rampage in an attempt to infect other people with corruption as well, which is funny because this perfectly matches up with what happened in the investor video. A nuclear explosion irradiates the Brawlers and corrupts their thinking. I don't think that's coincidence. Danny described Starr Park as toxic, and I think he means in more than one way. Just a moment ago, I said I believe that the gems were one way of growing the germs that we see in the biodome and some are monsters, that they somehow fed on the radiation in the park. Well, do you know what you just so happened to find in the gem mine environment? That's right, mushrooms. And while it may not seem like it, this could be a bigger revelation than it seems. Because while most fungi typically feed off of decaying matter, there are a few exceptions to this rule, like the disaster of Chernobyl, which wreaked havoc on the ecosystem to the point where many scientists and environmental activists were concerned that the site would not be habitable for thousands of years. But deep within the core, quietly growing, was a different type of mushroom thriving on the radiation, and this fungi wasn't only feeding on the radiation, it was mutating because of it. This process is called radiosynthesis, in which an organism uses radiation as a form of energy. Going back to the gem mine, we know that there are two types of gems, green and purple, one being the type you can buy for money and the other being the type you collect in the game mode. And as we covered before, purple is often associated with the germ, but green seems to be the universal sign for radiation. The green gas is one example, but in many depictions within pop culture as well. Starr Park seems to be a perfect ecosystem of toxicity, with the virus feeding off the radiation and corrupting the gems, but then in turn, poisonous mushrooms also grow in the mines, feeding off the radiation as well, but in the process, these mushrooms also absorb the alien DNA while doing so. I believe this causes a mutation in the mushroom, which causes them to change from a harmless species into one that will corrupt the mind of anyone who eats it. Toxic waste is only waste if you don't have a use for it. Remember, it's not a biohazard, it's a bio-opportunity. Next up, let's talk about Colette. Colette was the first brawler to be added to the Starr Park gift shop trio, the same update where the investor video made its debut in the Season 3 Brawl Talk, and so it's obvious that the very same character released with the crescendo of the lore would have strong connections to the lore herself, mainly in the form of the webmaster, whom I believe to be Colette. This is mainly because the entire purpose of the website is to be a collection of merchandise from when the park was still active, which just so happens to be Colette's entire theme, with even her name being a pun on the word collect. And Shelly, Spike, Jessie, Colt, Piper, and Nita can all be crossed off the list as well, because in the caption of the name tags, the webmaster says they never have my name in stock, meaning that none of those are the identities of the person updating the website. Plus, the fact that StarPark.biz is called an official fan site and Colette is said to be a crazed fan of brawlers, such as Piper and Spike, seems to point to her being the culprit. But that's not the only place where we can see a version of Colette. For example, we can go back to the Starr Park gift shop, where we can see these two cashiers posing as the same brawler, and this is especially interesting. Now, while I've claimed that these two cashiers are wearing quote-unquote skins of Colette in past theories, I think the scene also serves another purpose in the grand scheme of things, because if we take a look at Lola, she sports those same exact sharp teeth as Colette, almost like a duplicate version of her, and that's even stranger when you consider her super centers around creating an exact clone of herself, just like the duplicate version of Colette that we see in the investor video. These two were even shown to have a connection in the introductory community post hinting at the Season 9 Brawl Talk, where Colette is said to be Lola's biggest fan. Though it's worth saying I don't think that the rabbit hole goes any deeper than this, and that it's merely tying everything together, with Lola being based on the twin cashiers. But there is another brawler in this scene that does have bigger connotations. That's right, Gus. Now Gus, at first glance, appears to be a normal child visiting Starr Park for a vacation, but beneath that adorable exterior is a lot more than meets the eye. The first time we ever saw him was this statue in the Starr Park gift shop, which is being used to display the balloons that the park evidently sells. We can also find these same balloons on the StarPark.biz website, with some very interesting captions. Michael CB actually made a couple videos going over the lore of Gus, where he also covered these photos. He pointed out that the original air is a good indicator that these are filled with green gas, or showdown smoke, since we can see the same green gas multiple times throughout the season. But another important aspect of Gus is his voice lines. From the get-go, his obsession with Spike is heavily apparent.
Is that Spike? I really hope Spike is watching this. Maybe I'll get to meet Spike.
But surprisingly, not as unhealthy as Colette. But while Colette is probably obsessed with Spike because he's cute, something tells me Gus is intrigued by him because he's spooky, and for another reason.
Words aren't always enough. Sometimes you gotta fight.
Both of these pieces of dialogue don't really sound like something a young boy would say. They sound very reminiscent of a freedom fighter, that words won't always cause change and that sometimes action is needed. And we have another certain organization in the lore that shares these views to a T, the Starr Park Union. And while we don't know much about Spike or even whose side he's on, we do know that the character is the metaphorical face of Spewed, as the person who delivered the package was wearing none other than a cactus mask, and it's referred to as the Mascot Union in their protest poster, with Spike being one of the two big mascots of Starr Park. Plus, the fact that he's crossing his fingers behind his back indicates that he's lying about something, because while crossing one's fingers in front of your body typically means good luck, doing it behind your back indicates that their statement is untruthful. What's untruthful? The front of being just another innocent victim at Starr Park. And while it may sound a little odd that a child would be part of a union, there is at least one other child that's part of Spew that we know of, that being Jessie, which we know because we can hear her try and get into the WKBRL stream.
Already told you, this is normal. We already told you, this is normal.
But we'll talk about her later, because while ghosts are scary, there's one thing that's even more terrifying to the next brawler: children. While his backstory is pretty vague, we do know that he is currently a guardsman at the castle courtyard, who was once a school teacher that developed an unreasonable phobia of children and youth after some unspecified accidents. We can see several flashbacks that trigger his PTSD, which either could be related to current and future brawlers in-game, or random children that we will never get to see. The reason I entertained the idea is because some of the imagery shown here does relate to other brawlers in-game. For example, this vending machine is the exact same one that Frank breaks in Rico's Valentine animation. Like, the same exact one. Look at all the similarities. Which I guess means that Frank contributed to Grom's PTSD? When the camera pans to show all the young brawlers destroying the courtyard, Frank is pictured there as well, although he's dressed up as a security guard. And that actually makes sense, because while most people typically think of Frank as hundreds of years old, he's based off of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which, in the book, after he wakes up, he basically has the functioning of a newborn baby and has to learn to speak later, which would explain why Frank can't speak in any of the animations. But even then, I don't know why that contributed to his fear of kids. This doesn't affect him in any way. If anything, Rico should be the one traumatized. Regardless, a ripped teddy bear could allude to Nita, the gum under the desk could be BB's when she was a kid, if his teaching career was long enough, but as for the others, we really can't know for sure. But something that is very likely is that his scar was likely caused by one of these incidents. As we can see in his vandalized photo when he was just starting his career, he is missing that trademark scar on his right eye, and while we'll never know what the cause of it was, we can say that this was probably what chased him away from working in childhood education for good. Now, the big kicker of all this is mostly how Starr Park functions, because children play a big role in Starr Park's operations. Him being scared of children could also be alluding to the investor video, where our narrator finally snaps.
In the future, the children control us. We fight glowing rectangle.
Being forced to fight each other over and over for children's entertainment would probably put a damper on your worldview. But the last thing worth noting is some of his and Bud's voice lines, because while most of these include figurative language and sayings from Russia, there are several coded messages that revolve around bears.
The bear is in the circus. The bear is sleeping. The bear is dancing.
And while these could theoretically be referencing Nita, as Lil Crazy Cat 592 pointed out, it seems like the bear is actually referencing Grom himself, as when he is defeated, his walkie-talkie states,
The bear is sleeping.
A code to say that Grom has been knocked out. This also lines up with Russia often being represented by the Eurasian brown bear, with it being the national animal. As for the bear is dancing, I think it's a bit more straightforward, since it's the voice line for when Grom is in the lead, and just means he's celebrating. But the most notable one is the last one. The Starr Circus, or Carnival as Advertisement Guy once put it, has eluded us for a very, very long time. For years we have received hints and clues about some sort of clown-themed carnival related to Starr Park, and yet nothing has ever come of it. A clown face in Em's smoke from the Barley's Last Call animation, this weird object on StarPark.biz titled Clown Object. Heck, the plethora of circus themes are in a league of their own. It's obviously important, but the closest thing we've ever gotten to a circus is the stunt trio, as the tents are very reminiscent of the ones used in traveling circuses. And the clown item listed on StarPark.biz is said to be a must-have by the webmaster, meaning it's somehow important, because we're still receiving Easter eggs about clowns to this day. Like how Season 13 Deep Sea Brawl is called the Underwater Circus on these t-shirts in the Brawl Stars Championship, and contains a test your strength machine, which are often found at carnival stands. And then there's Clown Edgar, though it's worth noting that the canonicity of it is debatable, as the animator who was commissioned for it was asked if it was okay to put their own creations in the negative space. But I wouldn't throw it out yet, because the very same artworks from those animations have been placed into the basketball environment, so they are absolutely being endorsed by Supercell. And I'll be honest, I could absolutely see the development team adding it in, like the skins that have been teased in Animation 4. So it's almost certain that we'll eventually get to see the Starr Carnival, or the Starnival if you will, but since it's what started it all, I'm assuming it will probably be a lore-related update, and they'll save it for something big. But that's enough about Grom. Let's consider our next lore-inspired brawler. Where do I even start with this? Deep within the core of Supercell's headquarters, this thing was forged within the fires of Starr Park lore. I mean, everything from his voice lines to his design to how he fits in the world building, he's been referenced everywhere, and me and Michael talked a lot about him in our collab, essentially covering the amount of times he appears in previously established content and how he's one possible person who's running the livestream. But even in that 20-minute video where I was talking at the speed of light at 3 AM in an abandoned house to meet the editing deadlines because I was traveling across state lines, we still didn't cover everything. We already established how he's the one watching from above and controlling the security cameras in the Frontier World Showdown lobby, the Starr Park gift shop, and even Kairos Tim's recording studio. But one thing we missed were the cameras within the hub itself, because RT himself is a floating camera, and similar floating cameras can also be seen here in the hub watching the battle go down. But these very same hovering drones can be spotted patrolling the desert ruins of the spherical building in the 8-bit minigame, watching for any misbehavior. And in addition to that, we also have the invest video. Now, for a split second during a transition, we can see these two machines. One is easily identifiable as a radar, with the big green dots popping up on the screen, but the other is something called an oscilloscope, which can be seen on the Starr Park website, with the webmaster noting that it still turns on. Oscilloscopes are pieces of equipment used to measure oscillations, which is a fancy word for how waves wiggle. They can measure waves of electricity or sound, but here we're looking at radar waves, and it seems that they're being used here to help graph the radar, as they were used in conjunction with radar in early oscilloscopes to help indicate if the radar was picking up an object on the return bounce. And RT is a callback to this specific scene, as when he splits into his second form, he sends out radar waves to attack opponents up close, which also fits the theme of the hub, since its theme is location, and radar is used to locate and track weather, aircraft, and spacecraft. RT is everywhere, watching from the shadows and hiding in every crack and crevice, but in reality, the most compelling thing about him is his home base, the watchtower within the hub, because while it is a watchtower, you'll also notice that it's suspiciously shaped. See that rounded roof, the cylindrical base, the 4 rounded support beams, and the name of where it's located on the side? All of those traits are very similar to water towers. And that's important because water towers are a pivotal point in Starr Park's history. We can see them a couple times throughout the animations, such as in the No Time to Explain video and here in Frontier World, but we know that the employee handbook had the water tower page ripped out in order to prevent the employees from knowing how to put the fire out. But RT is the one watching the brawlers. He's the one giving information to upper management. He is the one that's in the wrong. So why is he the one using an empty water tower if Spewed was the one trying to keep Starr from using it? It doesn't seem like something he would do. Sabotage the water tower so that it would no longer be able to put out fires. Which I guess explains why the fire in the castle courtyard still hasn't been put out. But why is RT the one doing it? I mean, let's say for the sake of argumentation that WKBRL 1.0 and 2.0 were located in the watchtower. This seems to be the best place because it's well hidden, dim, and inconspicuous, and at the moment we really don't have another area that fits the setting of WKBRL better than the inside of the hub. Let's say that someone didn't want the safety crew to be able to put out the fire, drain the water out, and set up shop in the confined space. But eventually, when a certain someone tried to get back in, Starr Park was able to find its location, and took full control over WKBRL, turning it into
WKBRL.
The voice that hears you.
Where they moved the stream back to Super City, the origin signal of Starr Park Radio. But what do you do with an empty water tower? Well, you turn a water tower into a watch tower, where an adorably creepy robot can stalk the guests without being noticed. But if management was able to find WKBRL because they followed Jessie, what happened to her when they found her? Jessie is... well, Jessie. She's a child prodigy that has the mind of a genius, and she's actually one of the candidates for the person running the WKBRL stream. At the moment, there are 3, Pam, Jessie, and RT. And for the most part, I think that all of these are at least somewhat correct. Pam and Jessie are related, and the Junker family probably work together in order to get the stream up and running. There are 2 Junker gears after all, one on the stream and one on the transmitter in Tara's Bazaar. There's also the fact that Jessie has the same color scheme as the equipment, and both Pam and Jessie have experience in tampering with machinery. And the most pivotal piece of evidence is the explicit mention of Jessie.
Where is Starr Park? And what happened to Jessie?
Which is likely referring to Jessie trying to get back into the room in WKBRL 2.0. So it's almost certain that Jessie was at least one of the main orchestrators behind the WKBRL stream. But a while ago, we got a Jessie remodel, and while some people hate it, I don't understand how anyone could hate something so cute. It's definitely an upgrade from what we had. I mean, look at her, she finally has a new backpack, an upgraded gun, and look at that, she lost her square goggles. Those goggles, which look oddly familiar. 2 circular lenses with 4 round protrusions coming out diagonally off the ends, just like Belle's. And I'm kind of surprised that I haven't heard anyone point out the similarities between them. Let's review Jessie's mechanics. A bolt of blue energy that is shot out of a gun, and upon hitting an enemy will bounce to the next one, dealing less damage. Now let's review Belle's, a bolt of blue energy that is shot out of a gun and upon hitting an enemy will bounce to the next one, dealing less damage. Both of their attacks are essentially the same. The only real difference is Belle's is a bit faster and narrower, and both of those descriptions explicitly refer to their guns as rifles. One's a shock rifle and one is an electro rifle, but both of those have inherent connections to electricity. Their base attacks are incredibly similar. So what's their connection? Well, there are a couple theories. We know for a fact that Pam is Jessie's mom, but we still don't know who her father is. It could be Sam, which I find funny because of the ship name, but considering the distance between their ages is somewhere around 10 to 20 years, that doesn't seem quite right. But it would explain the connection to Jessie as her stepmom, assuming that Belle and Sam are a couple. But then why would Jessie take after her stepmom and not her real mom when they have no apparent relationship? It doesn't quite fit as well. And considering Belle mentions her unnamed son but doesn't feel the need to call out any daughter that she might have, seems to deter this possibility. In fact, they really don't seem to acknowledge each other in any way, which makes me think that they don't have any blood or family relation of any kind. And hold on, because this might seem a little crazy, but I actually don't think that Belle is related to Jessie, but that Belle is Jessie. And that theory isn't unbased. Despite the goggles and very specific choice of weapons, there's also the fact that Belle refers to herself as a welder.
Nothing beats a well-welding welder's weld. Where there's a will, there's a weld.
And Jessie, as part of the Junker Trio, is known for welding, just like we see in her concept art, this official post, and presumably how she repairs Scrappy with her first star power. But the final nail in the coffin for me is this poster on the Starr Park website, which depicts Jessie with Scrappy, who isn't quite robotic, but instead has a metallic arm replacing its front right paw, the exact same limb that Belle has replaced with her gold arm. And in the same poster, while it's almost impossible to read, appears to be the word chromatic, aka Belle's red. Hey, it's past turnip here. Remember when I said Alley Cat Bowl would cause problems down the line? Yeah, well, it's here, because this pet also has a missing front right limb that has been replaced with a golden arm. And it's not the only one, because it's the same with Gray, and El Mayordomo, and Maisie, and Corbin. And I don't know why, but Supercell seems to really like this design choice. Regardless, it doesn't take away from the theory, I just think it's funny how you can see the preferences of the concept team. Cool. Okay, back to the main theory. But now that we've laid out a substantial amount of evidence, there's the question of why and how. And well, I answer that with a question. Why is Starr Park called Starr Park, specifically with 2 R's? Well, in the Season 6 Brawl Talk, Danny says,
and we are going back to our Wild West roots with Belle.
Referencing how the game was centered around the Wild West during its beta, but I think it goes deeper than that. I know I've talked a lot about Disney and how it's a heavy source of inspiration for Starr Park, but I'm going to do it again because Disney World and Disneyland are both called that due to their founder's last name, Walt Disney. So what if in a similar way, Belle Starr, or a descendant of the Starr family tree, was the one to found Starr Park? Remember how the voice that hears you stated,
What happened to Jessie?
I think this has something to do with it. Belle and Jessie are somehow on opposite sides of the spectrum, but at the same time are 2 sides of the same coin. Jessie is working with Spewed, while the Starr family tree will be working with Starr Park. And I know that sounds wacky, but let's take a look at the community post for September 12th, centering around this brawler. Which brawler exactly? Good question, because at first glance it appears to be Sam, but as Hunt points out in his post, it also has elements of Colt. The boxing gloves, orange hair, and robot designs all belong to Sam, but he's wearing a holster, and Sam doesn't use guns. But that exact brown holster belongs to the same self-absorbed sheriff that we all know and love. Same thing with the mirror, with his description even mentioning the object straight out. And cross-referencing their designs, we can see the similarities between them as well. The 2 wrinkles on their eyes, the X on the chin, the sideburns that don't extend into a full beard, and the so-called brawn of the Gold Arm gang.
Brawn and beauty.
Plus, Paul actually confirmed in a tweet that the X isn't just a birthmark or genetic trait, but rather a scar that's implied to have some lore event behind it. So what are the chances that both Sam and Colt would have the exact same scar, in the exact same shape, in the exact same place? But even despite all that, and the fact that it doesn't seem like he has any relation, we can try and bring up the family tree again. Except, Sam isn't part of the Starr family tree. He is absolutely based on the real-life bandit, but many people seem to forget that Sam is one of the few brawlers with a still canon last name, that being Bronson, which means that he isn't Sam Starr while Belle is given her title, and that specific detail seems to imply that they aren't married, unlike their real-world counterparts. Instead, I think that it's once again the same case that we saw previously with Belle and Jessie, that Sam is either likely Colt from the future or from another universe. Because a really out-of-place detail about Sam is that instead of being Cherokee or even from the Wild West, he's British. Besides having a Cockney accent, he uses several phrases that originate from the UK. Oi, brown bread, argy bargy, shambolic are all used in countries like the United Kingdom or Australia, which mostly use British English. And Colt distinctly lacks that accent and dialect, which seems to imply that Sam isn't Colt from the future, but rather that the two are from parallel realities. And all of this leads me to believe that the third brawler within the Gold Arm gang will also have ties to another brawler already existing in the game. And I see a few possibilities as to who it could be, because in addition to having similarities to Colt and Jessie, the characters are also based on Sam and Belle Starr respectively, both of whom were Western outlaws in the real world. And so it's probable that the third member is also going to follow this trend, with ties to some sort of infamous historical figure and or the Starr family tree. Now, I've seen a lot of people theorize that the third member will be Belle's daughter, aka Pearl Starr, and I definitely won't make any attempt to disprove this, since Belle has been confirmed to be a mother twice over, both in her voice lines as well in the Mother's Day Challenge, but just as I mentioned when I was talking about her earlier, Belle mentions a son, but not a daughter. And so we can also take a look at Belle Starr's son, Eddie Reed. The less popular of the two, Eddie was also convicted of several crimes throughout his life before finally settling down as a deputy in Fort Smith. And I really gotta say, most of the crimes he's been accused of are pretty mundane. Horse theft, receiving stolen property, oh, and killing his own mother. Yep, one of the suspects in the mysterious unsolved murder of Belle Starr is her own son, which would explain the grudge Belle seems to have towards him. Who would have thought that a family of criminals would have such unhealthy family dynamics? Of course, there are several other possibilities as well, such as Henry Starr, who kept on getting falsely arrested for bank robberies, and like a normal person, decided to turn lemons into lemonade by robbing banks. For real this time. Because hey, if you're gonna get blamed for something, you might as well commit to the bit. And after almost getting hanged twice for murder he did commit, he got pardoned and decided to live a peaceful life. He settled down, became an actor in a few silent films, wrote an autobiography, created a gang, and robbed more banks. Old habits die hard, I guess. Why act out bank robberies when you can commit them in real life? However, there's only one spot left to be filled, so only one of these options can make it into the game. Or the devs could hit us with a curveball and replace it with something we never would have seen coming, like introducing a robot brawler instead of a human one, which would tie into the seemingly random Colt bot challenge that we got a few months ago. But that's actually based on the robot sheriff blueprints that we see on the Starr Park website. And while there are tons of other brawlers that have smaller lore implications, like how it seems likely that Amber was the one who started the fire in Starr Park, how Mandy and Chester's attack tie into weaponized food, how Rico, Daryl, and Barley are all part of the same series of robot, how Edgar's scarf somehow is Bones, how Willow's mind control is based off of the brainwashing in Starr Park, the implications of Bo being Nita and Leon's stepdad, old brawler descriptions that may or may not still be canon, and each detail about each specific brawler. And while I could cover those, I really don't want to bring a bunch of half-baked theories into the mix. Plus, this video is over a half hour long, and I don't want to extend it any further. But nevertheless, a big thank you to all of you for watching, and if you like the content, feel free to hit all the buttons below, as it does help the channel. Thank you to the Starchive and the rest of the people you see here for contributing to both this theory and the community in general. And until next time, make sure you have a day as bright as the stars.